Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bassam Haddad. I am the director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason University. I am also an associate professor at Char School, which is also co sponsoring this fabulous event. And it's also co sponsored by GLOA, Global Affairs, as well as the Global Islamic Studies, Center for Global Islamic Studies at George Mason and the Arab Studies Institute. We are very happy, excited, and fired up to learn more about the Algerian uprising, which is one of the recent developments compared to the earlier Arab uprisings from 2010. Even though Algerians are no foreigners to protests and revolution, we have with us today two fantastic scholars, both in terms of their insights, their analytical rigor, as well as in terms of their connectedness to what is happening on the ground in Algeria, which distinguishes them in a very crucial way, especially at a time when there's not much information out there. So I am joined today by the fabulous Miriam Halley Davis and the wonderful Thomas Serre. And I've learned to say his name because we're not supposed to say Thomas and we're not supposed to say Serres. So it's Thomas Serre, and it sounds very, very nice. I am very happy as well that they were able to join us on short notice, given some of the developments recently in Algeria. And this constitutes the last um, podcast slash event for MIAS during class time, because we will be going on in the late spring and early summer with a lot more programming on the Middle East and Islamic Studies program. So without further ado, welcome Miriam and Toma. Hold on, I have you muted. Exactly, of course, I'm gonna have you muted because that's how the world works. Welcome, Miriam and Toma.
I'm even happier to be here now that I'm unmuted.
Absolutely. أهلا Toma. Bonjour or bonsoir.
Bonjour,
عندك.
bonjour.
Uh,
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely, it's always a pleasure to have you both, and I am also looking forward to this conversation. We will be having a Q&A later on if people are interested in asking questions. However, I would like to remind people that we do like to ask people to identify themselves. So before we get into the thick of things, can you tell us just a snippet about what is happening today in Algeria in terms of the protest movement, the Hirak? And before we continue with that conversation, because I know there's a lot going on, maybe we can, after a snippet, maybe we can go back and address the history of the Hirak so people can be clued in as to the trajectory. Please feel free. This is conversational. Please feel. I know this is something that you've been writing about endlessly and following. So we'll make it conversational in order to sort of maximize our time. Feel free to go in any order, and feel free to jump in to cut me off or cut each other off politely. And the floor is yours. Oh, wait a minute. This is not cool. On my part, we actually need to make sure that we introduce these fantastic people properly. So what I will be doing is addressing the
People can Google us, Bassam.
no,
Yeah, they can Google us.
no, c'est pas, no, ça ne va pas, or whatever you say in French. So basically, I would like to share with our audience a brief snippet about Toma and Miriam, because they are with us and people should know what you guys are doing. So Professor Miriam Hale Davis is, oh, there we go. We have a bit of a technical issue. Don't worry, everything's gonna be okay. So Professor Miriam Halley Davis is I can't see.
I'm an assistant professor at the University
Assistant
of
professor
California,
in
Santa
the
Cruz.
Department of History. Yes, we got it at the same exact time. I think our patients ran out exactly at the same time. So Professor Miriam Halley Davis is an assistant professor in the Department of. Is it associate now?
No, not yet.
Okay,
Mazal.
because I almost promoted you.
I would
Is
have.
assistant
I hope my
professor.
dean is listening.
is assistant professor in the Department of History at UCSC. And her current book project investigates how colonial ideas of Islam underpinned the construction of economic planning initiatives in Algeria. And Thomas Serre is an associate researcher with. Um, Thomas, you're gonna have to help me. What?
Développement et société.
Oh, because it has all these like fonts here.
Accents.
In Paris, and an adjunct professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I must say again that they have been following these unfolding events with a lot of intensity and closeness. And there's a lot that I can share about them. They are also co-editors of the Maghreb page on Jadaliya and have been extremely prolific in the past couple of years. So I'll leave the question out there that I shared, and we await your responses.
Thomas, do you want to
Should I
start?
go, Mariam?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I can do that. As far as the situation in Algeria as we speak, I think that it can be summarized quite simply in with 3 points. First, and quite naturally, given the usual practices of the Algerian regime, they have scheduled legislative elections for the month of June, which will allow them to co-opt a new generation of politicians to replace, if everything goes well, those who were definitely discredited by the Hirak. So this is one first element to keep in mind, that these elections create some kind of strategic conundrum for opponents. Do you go there? Do you participate in these elections? Even if the electoral process itself is profoundly discredited, because there is this possibility of renewal. So do you want to be part of the new National Assembly? Do you want to gain political leverage? Now, the political field in Algeria is divided. You have opponents who refuse to participate in these elections, mostly political parties on the left who have rejected this process. And you also have political parties, mostly liberal or Islamo-conservative, I would say, who belong to the opposition in a broad sense, who will participate in these elections. So this is one first point, an opportunity for the regime to renew its political face and to regain some kind of political legitimacy, even if the problem inherent to these elections is that the participation will likely be extremely low, the voter turnout. The second point is that the Hirak turned 2 in February, so it's now a movement that is entering in its third year. It's continuing. You have a weekly protest, and these weekly protests are met with fierce repression, especially because of these elections, these upcoming elections, that create a tension, because it's another opportunity for the regime to regain some kind of legitimacy. And they are more than eager to regain some kind of political legitimacy because they have been unable to produce any for a very long time. Therefore, those who are calling for a boycott, those who take part in the marches of the Hirak, are perceived as more than ever as a threat to the stability and security of the state. And last point that is important is, as far as I can tell, the economic situation of the country is deteriorating constantly, and this creates another layer of emergency, which is the economic emergency that complements the political emergency. So that would be my rapid overview.
Mariam, please feel free to just because this is conversational, do not wait for my prompt.
Let's converse. I'm going to converse right now.
Converse.
So, I mean, I appreciate what Thomas said about the temporality and the Hirak turning 2. just to make that concrete, today was the 116th Friday that people were on the streets. And so this kind of long-term temporality and what does a revolution look like over that kind of a time span is something that I think we're still grappling with. The repression has been especially notable and brutal. There have been reports of torture, of sexual assault. And so this is also something that is reminding people of the Civil War in many ways, that they have been very clear, the protesters saying this is a peaceful movement. The regime has made it clear that they're not going to abide by those rules. So those are a couple of the things that I think most of us watching are attentive to at the moment.
Okay, at this point, as I asked you to be brief a little bit, just because I would like us to go back to the discussion of what is going on right now and what some of the prospects are. So many of us, even in Middle East studies, which is actually kind of like an important issue, even in the Arab world itself, have less information, just basic information as to what is happening in Algeria. I mean, I grew up in the region, right? And we studied the Algerian Revolution, so we know a lot more about the 50s and the 60s than about very much after that, except for Shab Khalid and the Algerian football debut in the, was it 82 when they beat
82.
Germany?
The infamous
Yeah, we beat they beat Germany. Yeah, that's
rigged game between Germany and Austria. Yeah.
awesome. So exactly, there's very little information. So if you don't mind, please feel free to go in any order. If you share with us a little bit about the trajectory of protests, because one of the things that we try to emphasize, whether in terms of our writing or in the classroom, first of all, is that protests in the region and uprisings are not new. It's not that people were dormant and then there is a spring, which is why I think the term spring is a misnomer. Um, there's always been a trajectory of protest despite repression. So if you can share with us some of the history leading up to the to the Algerian uprisings, and why things didn't percolate earlier, given that the Tunisian uprising did spur some of the neighbors, even far away neighbors, to sort of join the protests.
Yeah, I mean, I'll maybe take a start with that in terms of, even the FLN as a political movement, which most of the people watching have probably read Frantz Fanon. They followed the Algerian Revolution. They've watched the Battle of Algiers. And even at the kind of early moments of the FLN's history, it was not uncontested. There were segments of the Algerian society that rejected either some of the political formations, particularly the accent on an Arab and on an Arab Islamic personality that was the basis of the nation state. Many of those protests came from Amazigh Berber movements who felt that their identity was being sidelined. So from the very beginning, even though the revolution presents itself as this unitary Jacobin, teleological march of history, there were dissenting voices. And of course, as is the case with most anti-colonial revolutions, it was important to provide a unified face to the revolution. Even if, as soon as the country achieves independence, it almost slides into civil war with different factions, geographically rooted, politically rooted. I won't, get into the details of that. But in terms of protests to the FLN and their vision of a kind of one-party state early on, there's protests from the get-go. And indeed, as we've seen with the Hirak, the question of Berber identity has been, which the regime for a long time played off of as a threat, as undermining national unity, has really been embraced by most of the actors of the Hirak, saying, no, this is a part of our richness and diversity. And so that old game of divide and rule that had been successful, even though, of course, there are still some who say, the Hirak has been co-opted by those who want an independent Kabylia or separatists of the MAC. So I guess as the historian just wants to start by saying, even from the beginning and these glorious narratives of the FLN that we have, that was always a contested image of the nation state.
Yeah, I mean, to follow up on what you just said, Mariam, I think that one of the problems, the recurring problems for people looking at Algeria from the rest of the Arab world is that they misconstruct the historical trajectory, in the sense that they ask the question that you asked, Bassam, why didn't something happen in 2011 in Algeria? Why are they 8 years late? But the truth is, from the perspective of most Algerian activists, or even, by the way, people who support the regime, Algeria is more, let's say, 20 years early. And the first moment of massive protest against the single party system happened throughout the 1980s with Islamist and Berberist mobilizations, and culminated, and also with a very strong workers' movement in factories and in various economic units, and culminated with the uprising of 1988. So the temporality that characterizes the Hirak is one that is different. It's neither late or early. It's just some very long-term processes. So if we try to compare what is happening in Algeria to what is happening in other parts of the world, if you look at Egypt, if you look at Tunisia, even if you look at Syria, you have the same kind of mobilizations very early on. In Syria, you have the uprising of the Muslim Brotherhood at the end of the 70s. You have massive mobilizations in Tunisia, in Egypt in the 1980s. So these are like uprisings that are part of a long-standing history of rebellion against military bureaucratic regimes, even if in Tunisia the military are not an essential component of the ruling coalition. And so clearly, the 2011 or 2019 are not a break as much as a moment of revival of previous forms of protest in a different form, with different ideological commitments, or as some would say, without a clear ideology, but nonetheless, movements that are clearly part and parcels of a broader history of rebellion, which was interrupted in all of these cases by state violence, which brings us to something important in the Algerian case, the Dark Decade. The Dark Decade, which at so many levels derailed the trajectory of Algeria.
Thank you very much. Can we talk a little bit about the question of the local internal movements, the specific movements themselves, and the internal politics that culminated in the emergence of mass protests recently in the past couple of years? Very little information is available, even for those who follow. We would like you to just clarify for us.
Yeah. Bassam, we lost you.
We lost you, yeah.
But I think I can take the question. I think I got it. So since this is conversational, I'll converse once again. I mean, one of the questions about who the players are, I was looking back at an interview that I had done for Jadaliya with Dahour Jourbal, a very prominent Algerian historian, back in 2012. And he told me negotiations between society and the state no longer follow the channels of official parties, right? And so I think one of the things that is difficult for many people looking to Algeria and wanting to know who the players are is that it doesn't get summed up at the level of political parties. And I think, I'd be curious, Thomas, to hear your thoughts on this. But often we hear, well, the Algerian people were apolitical. You can see that because they don't vote, with a kind of judgment that they should be voting. And this is, unacceptable behavior. They're kind of bad Democrats for not voting. Why aren't they voting? So they don't have any kind of political consciousness. And that was and nothing was happening. And indeed, from the ground, there was an amazing kind of multiplication of protests, often called riots, occurring over very specific issues. that are less sexy to report on, right? Students protesting for a single issue that the state is able to meet them halfway on. And this kind of routine, this is something that Thomas describes in his book, the kind of routinization of these specific demands on the one hand. And then on the other hand, in the more recent weeks, we've seen a crackdown on associations. So SOS Bab el Wad, for example, which is a kind of youth organization that does a lot of cultural activities, a lot of debates. And what is it that's so threatening about these organizations for the state? It's that this has been a platform for people to come together and discuss and create kind of bonds of solidarity. Does that make it a political actor? According to most analysis, no. But I think what happened with the Hirak is, finally the fifth mandate was one, this was a slap in the face that brought together a lot of really diverse people and to the street, as Taho was saying, not to political parties, and including those who had never been quote unquote politically active before, right? Who had a new kind of slogan of Yetnahuga, they could get behind this, that they all must go, but who didn't see themselves reflected in the political system. So in asking, who are the components of this, it's been, I think, difficult because it's not summed up by the political party system or, certain associations. It's really been a mosaic of different actors in civil society, human rights group. The students have been an amazing presence. They have their own protests on Tuesdays that are now facing very intense repression. And I'd love to come back to why, the repression against these, these young people between the ages of 17 to 23 seems to be heating up. So, that's, I think, an unsatisfying answer that I'm not able to pinpoint, specific associations, but that I think is the political field in Algeria at the moment. Thomas, I cited your book, so I feel like you should now.
Cited my book, so yeah, my sales are going to be boosted.
Yeah.
So I will. Why are you part of my profits?
Thank
so
you.
I think that one of the I'm sorry to contradict you. Partly, it's not to contradict you per se, but just to add the nuance.
Thomas, not a good idea. Not a good idea.
No, I know. But I feel, I don't know. I mean,
I'm just
am I in
joking.
a position of expert, or am I supposed to negotiate my private life on the side?
That's okay. You're allowed. You're allowed.
Okay. So what I wanted to say is that this idea that people who weren't politicized massively invested the public space works in Algeria for the first 3-4 months. Then at one point, the Hirak becomes a long-standing mobilization, and only those who have the energy, the commitment, the stamina to continue the struggle become long-standing actors of this movement. So the Hirak has this kind of cross-sectoral, cross-generational mobilization that involved a vast majority, I would say, of the Algerian population.
Sure.
In a way, ended in June 2019 with the repression of the movement by Gaid Salah, who was the chief of staff of the army. So there is clearly, and what you said was absolutely right, in terms of trying to find political parties or political actors who are leading the movement, this doesn't exist. There is an infrastructure of social movements that existed before that, as you mentioned, were notoriously active in autonomous trade unions, groups for the defense of human rights, youth groups such as SOS Bab el Wad or Rashed, even if SOS Bab el Wad was not technically, before the Hirak, a very politicized movement. Rashed was a much more politicized movement, but directed toward the youth. But at the very same time, and what is interesting with the second phase of the Hirak, that of the long-standing struggle after the beginning of this massive state repression, following the orders of the military leadership and Gaid Salah in particular, is that movements, political movements, who are not per se political parties, created before the Hirak, have been able to become prominent players in the movement precisely because they are not political parties. Political parties are profoundly discredited in Algeria. It seems very difficult for a political party at this point in the history of the country to claim any kind of legitimacy. Even for the FLN, even for the FFS, which is the oldest opposition party in Algeria, even for the MSP, which is technically the most powerful Islamist, quote-unquote, party in Algeria, these movements are profoundly discredited. But you have political movements that claim to be non-ideological and that focus on regime change and fostering convergence that have become increasingly present in the movement that were created either in the mid-2000s, such as Rashed, Harakat Rashed, which is a movement created by former members of the FIS, human rights activists, defectors of the Algerian state, or another movement that is playing its role currently is Ibtikar, created in the late 2010s, I don't remember, 14, 15 maybe.
Yeah, I want to jump in here, Thomas. Thank you for pointing out that we should think about the different sections of the Hirak, and also just to remind people who maybe haven't been following this as closely that at one point Tebboune tries to say, there was the good Hirak, the Hirak Beni, that's over, and now this is the bad Hirak, right? So the co-option goes so far as Tebboune himself saying, that was acceptable, it did its job, but now it really should be over. And the other thing I wanted to, sorry to cut you off, to mention is that the role of Rashed, for those who are watching and might not know, has been extremely controversial. This has been all over newspapers, talking with activist friends, to what extent Rashed should be allowed to play a role and the role of the diaspora. So I just wanted to flag that, Thomas, but please go ahead for people who might not be aware of how charged that discussion is at the moment.
No, that's a very important point. You're absolutely right to emphasize the fact that Rashed is at this point in the movement probably one of the most vilified actors, portrayed by the regime, but also by some opponents as a kind of neo-Islamic Salvation Front, some kind of almost terrorist entity financed by Turkey. Some kind of demonic mix of Islamic fundamentalism and I would say anti-national expatriates, and clearly the fact that Rashed is an important part of the Hirak doesn't necessarily means that it creates convergence. It's one of the main issues at this point for the movement is that probably the movement that is the most organized, the more able to formulate an idea, to communicate and to be active from abroad, but also in Algeria, is also one that creates a lot of fear, a lot of suspicion, because Rashed, even if they don't want it, even if the members of this movement do not necessarily see themselves as Islamists, are systematically framed as Islamists who endanger the country and who endanger the civil liberties of the people. So that's an important element to keep in mind for sure. But I want to add that members of the movement Rashed are, for many of them, were not actively part of the Islamic Salvation Front, and also many of them are former human rights activists. So the fact that this movement has been systematically framed as a neo-FIS is a construction of the regime, and it's fairly convenient for the Algerian regime to find some kind of new nemesis. Because since they are not able to produce legitimacy, the only thing that they can do is to produce massively illegitimacy. So it's Algeria at this point is like reverse democracy. It's reverse democracy. You just produce massively illegitimacy because there is no institutional framework to produce political credibility.
Thank you so much, both, for this really rich discussion and back and forth. I would like us to talk a little bit about the regional situation before we go back to some particularities, and before we go back to the current moment before we close. Um, if you can tell us a little bit about the relationship between Algeria and its neighbors in relation to the uprisings, to protests, and to general developments and processes, uh, broadly speaking. So, we speak about the region in terms of subregions sometimes. For instance, the Arabian Peninsula includes the Arab Gulf countries for the most part. People speak of the Levant or the Fertile Crescent, or Bilad al-Sham, what have you. I mean, there are different connotations for these terms. And then Egypt and Sudan, or Egypt is sort of like you know addressed by itself for the most part. But then there's North Africa, Al Maghrib. So to what extent did the past 10 years or the past few years change, construct or reconstruct that notion of the Maghrib in terms of the ability or the actual influence of these countries on each other in terms of their politics, their mass mobilization, and what have you. If you can just shed some light on that, that would be wonderful. And feel free to do some historical comparison.
Thomas, why don't you start with that?
Yeah. What I witnessed in 2011 and 12 was an attempt by activists in Algeria to establish some kind of cooperation with Tunisian revolutionaries. And there was clearly an attempt to organize meetings, to organize conferences, but it was rapidly identified by the regime as a major threat. So the uprisings of 2010-11 in the region, notably in Tunisia, but also Libya, Syria, and Egypt, have been systematically portrayed as an Arab winter or a spring of the graveyards. So something that is just a pure evil, and that should remind Algerian citizens of the dark decade, at least in the way in which the regime framed it. But attempts to create solidarity existed. It's just extremely difficult given the fact that Algeria is a police state. So that these are like huge limitations to this kind of to the possibility to move freely between a state or another. Nonetheless, at this point, many Algerian activists are active from abroad, notably in Tunisia, notably in France, notably in Morocco. As for the states in the region, the Moroccan state is fairly happy with the generals in Algeria because it allows them to have some kind of local nemesis to play their own nationalist game. And the Tunisian state is in crisis, is going through a revolutionary process, and cannot afford to question whatever is happening at the level of the Algerian state. So I guess this to say that the regional context certainly was certainly instrumentalized to support conservative or reactionary agendas in Algeria. But despite all of these obstacles, activists try to create some kind of networks of solidarity.
Yeah, and I remember being in Algeria around the American intervention in Libya and Gaddafi's assassination, and that was really seen as, this is what could happen to us. And the regime, I think, got a lot of play. And again, there is a third worldist notion of sovereignty at play here. That's not, that I think we shouldn't be too quick to discount either, which said, this is why we can't let the foreigners in. We're afraid of this kind of intervention. And the other thing I wanted to mention Tama and I, with some other colleagues, both worked on a glossary of the Hirak from Morocco and Algeria. And it's kind of, in some ways nostalgic to think back to that, because it was this moment where there seemed to be more convergences happening, at least than there is now. The situation in the Western Sahara, borders are closed. I think this dream of a pan-Maghreb North Africa, many people hold as a kind of effective attachment, but there is no political structures, or very few, other than individual efforts and activists who do have those forms of mobility. And I'm always taken aback. Also, I've gotten this question a few times. The regional context for Algeria is also France. There's no denying it, and it's not being neo-colonial to say that. The diaspora has played a really important role in all of this. The question of the diaspora has been on the forefront. At one point, the state threatened to take away the passports of people who are binational. There have been Algerians stuck in France who can't get back to Algeria because borders are closed. So the regional context is, of course, the Maghreb, and that's shifting for different geopolitical reasons and historical structures that make this a difficult kind of solidarity to really blossom. But also the question of the diaspora, particularly in France and further afield. I mean, not only in France.
France, the UK, and Switzerland, which are the place where most political opponents live. Places.
Folks, I mean, Miriam, you stole my last question. My last question, not my last question, my next question, I should say, on the glossary, which you mentioned. But if you can say a little bit more on that and where it appeared and how people can access it, that would be great, because it's one of the things that will, it's a window into some of the more local and sometimes some of the most meaningful aspects of an event that gets lost in this big politics conversation and discourse.
Yeah, I'd love to talk more about that. And that is something that came out as a handout that I was giving my students in class to help them understand what was happening in Algeria. And I just thought this has been so fun. And we collaborated, with colleagues on that. So I believe if you Google Hirak Glossary on Jadaliya, it should come up. It was a 2-part series. And our idea was to think about protest terms and also to give some attention to the diaglossia, the linguistic diaglossia at work, as you see, Fusha, Darija, French, Spanish, English, all coming together in these phrases. And one of, I think, the amazing things about the Hirak has also been a kind of reappropriation and a new sense of pride in Algerian Arabic, and saying, which has often been denigrated, which has often been a kind of symbol of, you would hear Algerians are illiterate in both languages. I mean, there was a real denigration of Algeria's linguistic life, both from in France, but also other countries in the Middle East. And of course, one of the most iconic videos now is a young man being interviewed on Sky News, and the interviewer keeps saying "بالعربية بالعربية," and he basically says "هذه العربية نتاعنا." I don't. Like he basically says, I don't speak your Arabic. This is the way I speak Arabic. Please stop disciplining the way I speak in public. And he's the one who came up with the slogan, Nahuga, which has become the kind of trademark of the Hirak. So, the question of language has always been central to Algerian nationalism. And for me, at least, the glossary was one way of thinking about that, and giving people, who perhaps aren't following things, I think also an insight into some of the reoccurring symbols like, Balad Miki or other, other very specific tropes of protest. And Toma can probably say something about the link with football and supporters.
Please, yes.
At the Ultras Stadium.
Anything about football?
Actually,
football.
I have nothing to say about Algerian football at this point, because my team was beaten by an Algerian, Riyad Mahrez, just killed the PSG. So I'm going to boycott Algerian footballers for now.
He doesn't mean that. He doesn't mean that.
Just to make sure the audience knows, we're talking about the real football, not the football that they talk about in the United States that you actually play with your hands, like the actual football that you play with your feet. Yeah.
Exactly, like real football. But I wanted to say something about slogans in the sense that even if these slogans are in Arabic, they express ideas that are not necessarily specific to the region. So when a key slogan in the Hirak is Dawla Madaniya Mashi Iskaria, it's very clear. It's not something that is like specifically Arab. People want a civil state, not a military state. It has been a key component of political mobilization in Algeria for more than 60 years. And it will continue to be an essential component in the Algerian political life as long as the military do not retreat from political life. And the problem is that this slogan, very simple, that makes a lot of sense, is manipulated by those who say if you don't want the army to be involved in politics, then you're against the army. But nobody is against the army in Algeria. The army is a legitimate organization because of its legacy, of its revolutionary legacy. And there is a lot of respect for the army as the heir of the ILN. Nonetheless, when people say Dawla Madaniya Mashi Iskaria, they just ask for the military to do their job.
Right.
That's very simple.
And just to, one of
something
the
that we can
early
understand.
slogans was indeed Shab Jeish Khawa Khawa from, right, this was one of the early iterations, and Ghaid Salam al Khawana, the notion that, you know, he's the traitor, but the people and the army, this is a popular army. So that's an important point.
But nonetheless, something that we can add is that while at the beginning this notion of the people and the army being together was essential, the more this situation of political crisis continues, the more the ruling coalition refuses to pay attention to the very legitimate demands of its citizens. The more the slogans become radical, and you have people saying Muhabarat Irhabiya, accusing literally the intelligence services of being murderers, terrorists, people who are criminals and should be criminalized and punished. And this was not part of the agenda at the beginning. So there is a radicalization, and what is problematic is that the military have been very wary of having their position questioned, historical, political, and economic, questioned by the Hirak. But if they continue to systematically prevent any kind of reform by supporting a bureaucratic and political elite that is purely illegitimate, well, they will just undermine the reputation of the army. They will just further fuel claims and slogans that attack directly the security services. And that's the worst case scenario. Nobody wants that in Algeria. And that's something that we need to emphasize. The security services in Algeria do not want violence. Technically, they do not want mass violence. The people doesn't want mass violence. So there needs to be some kind of settlement at one point. And what we see at this point is just the regime continuing in doing the same thing again and again without paying any attention or paying any respect to its population, and reproducing the same kind of massive illegitimacy. And that's, I think, is quite worrying. I want to be optimistic, but at one point when after 2 years and a half of peaceful protest, the same military leaders do not pay attention to very simple claims, well, they fuel radicalism. And no, people are calling them terrorists in the streets. So that's a problem.
Thanks for this. Can we talk a little bit about the external dimension and the idea of protests and mass movements for democracy are addressed in a way that makes makes some people think that yes, there are certain countries in the world, especially in Europe and the United States, that support democracy and want to spread and promote democracy. And in relation to, and of course there are.
Who are these people? Who are these people, Bassam?
Yeah, I mean, I know them.
I know. Just Google democracy promotion in the United States. You'll get courses, you'll get syllabi, you'll get books, you'll get congressional testimonies, you'll get more than than you'd like to see. So there's this on the one hand.
Yeah.
There's also the concern among what is called the counter-revolutionary current in the Arab world that is led by Saudi Arabia and its allies. and of course, supported by
Emirates.
external actors like the United States. So there are these two things, and then there's the third aspect, which I'm just trying to set you up to address a number of things as you see fit. There's the third aspect, which is local, and it addresses the question of foreign support, whereby we've seen, and I've personally seen, and have learned through your discussions, but I've seen yaftat or signs during the protest that basically amount to saying to the external world, just keep out. We're good, because they've learned from the experiences of other uprisings, Syria and beyond. So can you speak to any of these dimensions, and just share with us something about this external dimension? And one last thing, maybe that's a fourth dimension I should have added, the question of energy resources. I mean, Algeria is relatively rich with gas and other energy resources, and in that situation in Libya, it actually spurred NATO to intervene, as if they intervened, for the sake of all sorts of, humanitarian things. But had there not been oil in Libya, I'm not sure if the excitement would have been there. How does this factor play in Algeria? Why is it that we don't hear very much about that factor as an attraction to external involvement?
I mean, I'll just say something very quick, and then Thomas give you the symbolic microphone. But I mean, I think there is a bit of a catch-22. You're absolutely right. A lot of the slogans have been, about Gulf countries staying out, Saudi stay out, the U.S. stay out, and also, Macron, who has sided with Tebboune insofar as congratulating him. This is really, at a protest that Thomas and I were both at, a Hirak protest in Paris. People were saying France is a neo-colonial power. They're using us for access to the Sahel and this counterterrorism program, and this is a neo-colonial relationship that's still going on. So that is certainly at the forefront of their minds. At the same time, what do you do after 116 weeks when the international community doesn't seem to care, international media doesn't seem to care, and there's no political forces realigning on the ground? And so, I think, at least in talking to friends and activists, they want people to pay attention abroad, and they're right to. This has been an incredibly difficult and tenacious struggle they have led. At the same time, they are rightfully wary of people taking too much interest abroad for precisely the reasons you mentioned. There's a catch-22 about what does it take to rearrange a balance of power without international attention, and things. Groups like I believe it was Amnesty International had a report about torture and the crackdown on journalists, and those kinds of signs of credibility for the Hirak are important, even if there is also this notion that this is an internal issue, stay out of our business. So that's one thing that I've been thinking about.
Yeah, no, there is clearly this rejection of foreign interference makes a lot of sense. I mean, who would invite France or the US to intervene militarily in their country? That sounds like the worst idea ever. So obviously, from this perspective, there is a consensus across the spectrum. Nobody in Algeria will ever call for an external intervention. Because of history, but also because of examples across the region and beyond. That makes perfect sense. Nonetheless, I think that it's maybe a little simplistic to speak about a neo-colonial relationship between France and Algeria for one simple reason. The Algerian regime is not able to convince its population that they are competent, but they are absolutely able to convince their foreign partners to stay tuned, to continue negotiating with them for security reason, for energetic reason. You mentioned gas. Obviously, gas is a key factor in the equation. Also because Algeria is a market that is currently largely closed to foreign investment or partly closed to foreign investment. So there is a stake in opening this market and making a lot of money once there is a definitive liberalization of the Algerian economy, which will come at one point if the current budget crisis continues. So when people say that foreign actors do not pay attention to Algeria, they do not consider Algeria to be on top of their list, except for France. Obviously, for France, Algeria is like very important for historical reasons, for domestic reasons, for energetic reasons, for economic reasons, etc., etc. But the Algerian regime is never in a position of some kind of neo-colonial proxy. They can negotiate, they can play with the Chinese, with the Russians, with the Americans, with the French. They are able to play with all these international partners and to not be completely dependent on the French. Which means that what is happening right now with Macron being basically the main cheerleader of the regime abroad is that Macron is not only not serving the interest of France in the sense that the regime will be able to turn against him whenever they want, because they are smart enough, this they can do, but he is also fueling a very legitimate hostility toward France because France is behaving without the slightest interest for democracy. And if you look at what France is doing in the region, France is being an anti-democratic force in Libya, France is being an anti-democratic force in Mali, in Niger, in Chad, in Algeria. France at this point is as toxic as the Emirates. And I mean, the Emirates are a very toxic reactionary force in the Arab world. Well, France is at the same level. They are actively supporting Sisi, selling weapons to the Egyptian. For what? Why would you sell fighter jets to the Egyptians? So at this point, it's very important to say one thing. France is not helping itself. It's not helping the populations. It's merely being a pawn, a reactionary pawn in the region. And what it demonstrates, its absolute incompetence. And its lack of the profound conviction among French ruling elites that Arabs should not be allowed to govern themselves. And that says a lot about the so-called country of human rights. As you can see,
yeah, I'm certainly not going to disagree with you there.
Yeah, I mean, this is.
I'm certainly not going to disagree with you there, but I would just push back a little bit. Of course, in terms of geopolitics, there are other partners for Algeria to do business with. But, I'm also, as a historian, thinking about the recent Rapport Stora, which was commissioned by Macron with a prominent French historian, Benjamin Stora, to kind of settle the account of what happened during the War of Independence, as if Algerians needed France to come up with a definitive version of their own history, right? And so I guess when you're thinking about the symbolic field and the historic field, France's kind of cultural capital and attempts to domesticate Algerian history as part of its own political process does have a kind of neo-colonial aspect to it from where I'm sitting.
I mean, maybe a neo-colonial impulse, but they don't have the means of their ambition, which from a geopolitical perspective is kind of misguided. Which doesn't mean that they do not behave as a neo-colonial hegemon. That
Sure.
doesn't work. But as you said, this idea of publishing a report is just a way to fuel a debate that will be instrumentalized by the Algerian regime. It's not going to solve anything. Academics in both countries reject the report for different reasons. So what is it, if not just a mere political stunt? It's kind of sad when your understanding of history and colonialism is reduced to a succession of political stunts.
Thank you. Thanks, both of you. I would like to begin wrapping up because we are. No, wait a minute. We started at 10:30, not 10. Yeah, we have time. I hope you have a little bit more time, if you don't mind. So before we go forward, though, I would like to share that this event is also co-sponsored by the Arab Uprisings 10 Years On project, which is a 1 year long project that has a number of aspects to it. Here it is. Here I can show a little bit about it. Um, it actually includes a number of events, monthly events called signature events that are basically elaborate panels, and it also includes uh, a potential volume that will appear in a few years as a result of how long it will take to put it together. It's going to be somewhat comprehensive, peer-reviewed articles on the actual uprisings and various documentaries and films that help educators and everyone else to learn more about the uprising. It will also include book reviews on the same topic, essential readings, which are basically uh, texts that focus on a particular issue and address the readings that are significant from the perspective of the author on that issue, and an elaborate podcast of which this is going to be a part. And of course, this is a project. I shouldn't be saying of course, but this is a project that is produced or co-produced by MESPI, Middle East Studies Pedagogy Initiative, and is or has the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason as its co-sponsor as well, a major co-sponsor with 17 other research institutions from all over the United States, Europe, and the Middle East. So if you'd like to learn more, please visit the arabuprisings.org, the arabuprisings.org with an S, so that we can, you can get more information and follow the different aspects of the project, including the monthly panels and other panels that are happening between these major panels. One of them is this one,
Yeah.
actually. So sorry for taking that moment, but I wanted to share that this is what we're doing, and we're addressing basically the entire region.
Yeah.
Did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to say how wonderful the events have been.
Yes.
So,
Do you want to address anything that you actually, but actually you participated in a couple of these? Do you want to address anything that you felt is distinctly powerful?
well, I think, that a lot of us who have been involved around Jadaliya and different projects have been experiencing the post 2010, 2011 moment together in many ways, reading each other's works, editing together, hanging out together. And so I think this has been a really powerful way for us to formalize some of these discussions. And certainly the panel that I was on with Rosie Bashir and Shireen Saitli was really wonderful and felt cathartic for those on it. And I hope, the listeners enjoyed as well. But yeah, it's been a really nice kind of way of taking stock of where we are after a difficult year that, everybody's had.
Thank you. And Toma also participated. Actually, a good number of scholars from all over have participated, since we've had quite a few events. Uh, so before we close, or maybe even turn to a couple of questions which might actually be lingering online, can I ask you something that is kind of like a not a surprise, but something that I didn't prep you for? So feel free to pass. However, can you share with us um, just a snippet, just a little bit, about how you, as educators in the classroom, how you might begin introducing students who are undergraduate students, for instance, not students who know the region well and so on. How might you introduce students to the Algerian uprising and in the context of the broader Arab uprisings? But if you can just share any pedagogical comments that would assist either a layperson or an educator in in figuring out how to communicate the story, that would be great.
So, two things that I found with my wonderful students at UCSC, and we have really great engaged students, is one is just thinking about the imaginary of revolution and what an important place Algeria has held in that. I'm of course biased because I work on the Algerian Revolution, the first one. So, what I think, when they find out that Fanon was writing The Wretched of the Earth in Algeria, and that the Black Panthers then pick this up as the Bible of decolonization, or reading accounts of the Black Panthers in Algiers. There's a wonderful book by Elaine Mokhtafi, very easy to read. And it's bringing it back to touchstones that they understand. But that's important also in reminding them, I think, that revolution was an international vision. This was not about the Middle East had its revolution and Black liberation in the US had its revolution. So that's one thing that I've found useful. I often show the clip I just spoke about, where there is this interview with the young man who, and I think students really respond both to the notion that their generation has been sidelined and told systematically that they're not political, right? And yet they are getting the worst end of so many deals in the US. Like, that really resonates with them. And it also resonates, being kind of talked down to in terms of cultural codes, that this isn't the politics of respectability one is supposed to have. And so from there, then, you can think about why things are different between Algeria and Tunisia, between Algeria and Egypt. And it's really important, I think, not to collapse Algeria into this. And I know, we don't, most of us don't use the term Arab Spring anymore, but the Arab uprisings, I think there is a kind of hegemonic discourse around them. And Algeria is actually great for undermining that and saying, look at all the diversity and different timelines of revolution.
One second, Toma, before you answer, because I know you have a lot to say, because I've heard you speak on pedagogy and the Algerian uprising. Do you mind, Muriam, as Toma is sharing with us his viewpoints, do you mind doing something which is sharing with me, if it's okay with you, and if it's not copyrighted, and if the CIA and the IRS and the Gestapo is not going to come after us? Do you mind sharing with me the link so we can close the event with it, and then I'll just play it? How long is it?
It's about a minute.
Oh, okay. So maybe I can also play it. So please, if you don't mind, you can text it to me or email it, and I'll just queue it up if that's okay. Sorry, Toma, for interrupting.
No, I didn't have much to say because I already intervened on this topic. But I just want to add that it is true that showing football fans in stadiums being political, and being political before the Hirak, being political in 2018, 2017, shows that these kind of uprisings are not spontaneous. They are not like some kind of magical thing that results from the sudden awakening of a nation. They are the product of long-standing dynamics and efforts to produce contentious discourses. So, I mean, in class, I really try to show, to introduce various resources, clips, songs, movies that illustrate the long-standing struggle of the Algerian people for freedom and dignity. So that's something that I do. And since I teach this class on Algeria, I also speak about Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria a lot. I do the same thing for all of these countries, and I try to show that this is actually one long-standing revolutionary effort that can be traced back to the 1950s and decolonization. And that's important for our students to keep that in mind.
I'm really sorry, I'm not pulling up the correct link of the video. I don't know if it was taken down, but I can keep working on that.
No problem. I have one more thing to ask, and that is something that you both touched on a little bit. But if we would like to look at visuals that deal with the Algerian uprisings, whether it is memes, I did say Mimi a couple of days ago, and that was very embarrassing. Memes, graffiti, documentaries, film, video, or interviews, podcasts, what have you. Are there a few items that you would suggest, because they would really be a great way for, I mean, I'm also being selfish here because I also talk about the Algerian uprisings, and I as an educator as well would like to sort of have this entry point that is visual, because it really makes things um, come to life before we or as we are assigning text. And I know that we can potentially go back to the Battle of Algiers, but if you have any words on this, that would be great.
Thomas,
You
yeah.
want to say something, right? Yeah.
No, go
I
ahead.
just want to say that there is a new trend in Algerian documentaries, notably thanks to the amazing work of Nabila Janin and so there Habiba Janin, Nabila Janin. Oh merde, ça c'est pas bien. Je me souviens plus. Non, c'est dur. Beja Doc, which is an amazing association that has developed this tradition of documentary making in Algeria. And since I would say the mid 2000s, there have been a myriad of amazing documentaries made by young Algerian filmmakers that shed light on not only the struggle, but the dreams of this population and its diversity. And that's a tremendous resource to help students think about all of this. Visual resource and something that really looks at politics as a lived experience, something grassroots, something human. And that's, I think, you can find many of these documentaries, and I would be happy to provide you with a list or something like that.
Yeah.
Yes, actually, if you don't mind sending me, no big rush, but we could actually include them in the final version of this post, and we can also put them on the Facebook live feed even later on today. So I would appreciate it, including the interview, Muriam. If you can't find it, that's totally fine.
Yeah, and I did just find that link. So should I put it in the chat for this?
I don't think there's a chat at Ecam Live, but if you can text it to me or
WhatsApp
it or email it. Yeah, that would be great.
I'll email it. And yeah, just to echo what Thomas was saying, I think that the documentaries that have been produced, a lot of Habiba students have been wonderful.
Yeah,
unfortunately, I can't think of any kind of centralized place that analyzes the different symbols. I mean, I know a lot of the articles we've tried to run in Jadalia have sometimes done that. Elizabeth Perego's work has looked at humor, and but we have to kind of cull. There's been so much productivity and amazing creativity around slogans, around signs, that it's an embarrassment of riches. So I think often just going through all of that is the hardest thing. And Bassam, I'm just about to email you that link right now.
Yes, and as you do that, let me just ask, because it doesn't seem, I mean, you've been so comprehensive. I don't see any comments or frustrations on Facebook.
Oh, good. And nobody wants frustrations on Facebook.
Yeah, this is actually not so bad at all. So basically, is there a way we can just briefly mention something about the participation of women, more exclusively to talk about this? Something about the Sudanese uprising is interesting in terms of the overwhelming participation of women. Sometimes not just participation, but in really important cases, like leading the organization of protests and the sort of being in the forefront. What is the Algerian experience in this regard? And it has been actually remarkable throughout the entire Arab world, which is, again, a major corrective to certain viewpoints, like predispositions about this topic. And I hate to bring this topic up as if it's just like an add-on, because it's very much organic to everything we're talking about. But in some context, it actually does help to focus on it.
For what I can say that there has been a feminist carré in the protest early on in the Hirak in Algiers. Symbolically, the place of women was not as central as in Sudan, for what I can gather, but nonetheless, activists, women activists, have been very active in the students' movement, in various political parties. I think that some of the main, the most influential or most active members of Iptikar are not only but also women. So there is historically in Algeria a lot of women activists who are taking part in the political life of the country. I think that one of the things that we need to keep in mind to mitigate this obsession with the women participation in politics in Algeria is that this is something that the ruling coalition has instrumentalized since the early 2000s with the corruption of feminist activists who were fighting Islamism. And unfortunately, you also have a lot of very active women politicians who are supporters of or taking part in the reaction currently in Algeria, which is in a way proof that women are essential to Algerian political life because they can be both revolutionaries and reactionaries. Which is
right, just like any group of people. I think that one of the interesting things has been it's also been women from all generations, right? We often kind of chafe at the Western desire for the young non-headscarf wearing activists, right? There is a certain way that images of women travel and get taken up in different mediatic circles. And so one of the really wonderful things has been the cross-generational aspect and seeing women from different generations different social backgrounds. And I would also just say that in thinking about how the Hirak has been important in processing Algerian history, there's been a wonderful initiative called the Archives de lutte des femmes en Algérie, Archives Nadalat Nisa fil Jazair, that recovers the feminist movements around 1988, actually, and has scanned and made available an Algerian feminism that dates back to the pre-Hirak and the pre-Civil War. So I think so many of these initiatives, were halted because of the Civil War, because of displacement and violence. And one of the things that's happening in these kind of piecemeal fashions, whether it's documentary making or personal archive initiatives, is to go back and recreate the repositories of documentation and historical memory. And certainly with the feminist movement, it's been a really wonderful initiative and really run by, a few scholar activists. This is not a Mellon-funded initiative, unfortunately for them, but everybody should check out that Facebook page.
Thank you about that. This is really important, and it's something that, of course, there's been quite a few articles and books on for all the experiences throughout the Arab world. So we have been compiling some of this material, not just on gender, but also on other issues, in order to get a fuller perspective on what sometimes might be missed and what is necessary to address in a particular context, in a context that actually is not as I don't know, is basically is not as aware about the reality of gender relations in the region beyond the conventional and so on. Okay, so I have the link. You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I have the link with me. I don't know if it's actually allowing me to show the audio. I mean, to communicate the audio. So let me see 1 second if I could add a dimension here that will allow the audio to come out. All right, there we go. So I will play it regardless, and we'll see if if it works. It's only a minute, so it's fine. If it doesn't work, people can then watch it a bit later on. So hold on a second, please.
I know this almost by heart. I can do a running commentary if there's no sound.
You can see this, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'm gonna play it, and if you can, in the meantime, think about some closing words because we have taken a lot of your time. So here we go.
هي لا تزال مستمرة. الجزائريون يهنئون بعضهم بما تحقق لحد الآن، يقولون إنهم يمكن إنهم حققوا بعضهم يا أخو ما كاش منها عفوا
ما كاش منها، ماناش مقتنعين. قاعدتك بالتغيير نحاو بيون عاودوا داروا بيون واحد اخر، تنحاو كاع
عربية
تنحاو كاع
عربية.
ما نعرفش عربية، هذه هي الدرجة تاعنا.
شكرا. هناك من لم
I quoted it wrong earlier. I'm ashamed.
Okay. That's fine. So can you tell us what was happening?
Yeah, so this is the evening, Bouteflika has announced that he will not run for a fifth mandate. And she is saying, everybody's out celebrating. Isn't this wonderful? They all got what they wanted. And he literally, you all saw it. He imposes himself in the screen. She doesn't want him there. This is not, the kind of respectable interviewee subject she's looking for. And he cuts her off and he's saying, no, it's just a pawn. They're going to put another pawn there. This is not what we want. Nobody's celebrating, right? And he's kind of on the spot correcting her narrative. And then he's so insistent, she kind of has to let him speak. And that's at which point, right, she starts to tell him, بالعربية, and he says, ما نعرفش العربية. That's the ending moment where he defiantly, in this wonderful leather jacket.
Can you say what that means in English?
I don't, he says, so she's saying, please speak in Arabic and kind of Fusha, which is what she's speaking. And he says, I don't speak Arabic, which is funny because he's saying it in Algerian Arabic. I don't know Arabic. This is our Arabic, هذا العربية تاعنا. So this is, also a moment of Algerian defiance by having foreigners, even from the Middle East, define what the revolution is supposed to be, what its goals are, what its successes are, and I think is a really powerful image for what the Hirak has, with all of its mutations, as Thomas was saying, in different moments and internal contradictions. One of the, I think, a symbol that really encapsulates the hopes of the Hirak. That I still get goosebumps watching. I don't know, maybe it's just been a long pandemic year, but I always get moved by that clip.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So I'm gonna show before I ask you to close. I'm gonna show a picture which apparently just came up here, and it's going to it's somebody that I would like Thomas to say who he is. But I know that recently you're really upset with him.
Yeah, I know. I've seen the picture. Yeah, I've seen the picture. I knew that it was going to be.
So
yeah, he betrayed me. He's from Paris. He was born in Paris. This guy. He's amazing, an amazing player. But he just killed my team. So I would.
But
never
could you say who he is? And
he's a winger for Manchester City, and he scored 3 goals in 2 games against the Paris Saint-Germain in the semi-finals of the Champions League.
And he's Algerian.
And he's Algerian. He broke my heart.
So
I still like him. I will forgive him later.
Okay, that's very nice. That's very nice of you. All right. So
I don't know if he cares though.
Yeah,
I don't think he really. I don't think Mahrez is waiting for you to forgive him, Thomas. Worried about that. I don't think so.
So I really thank you for joining us and for sharing your views and your time with us. And I look forward to the links that you're gonna send. Just a couple of links, primarily on the question of audiovisuals, on the issue of audiovisuals. Before we leave, if you have anything to share about prospects going forward, just a minute or so, minute or two, if you like, on the Algerian protests and what we may look for, that would be great.
So I have 2 things to say, if I may. First, we saw with the clip that you just showed that in 2019, young Algeria knew exactly what the regime was going to do. They used to say, bring another pound and continue business as usual. So it shows that the regime is doing exactly the same thing over and over again, and that the people know exactly what they're doing, which means that it's a deadlock, and they are looking at each other, knowing exactly what is the next move. And what is happening currently is exactly what was planned 2 years ago, and that's very sad for the political imagination of the Algerian ruling elites. First point. Second point, I want to apologize to Habiba Janin, who welcomed me in Béjaïa 8 years ago for a session of Béjaïa Doc. But it gives me the opportunity to say that Habiba is one of these many women, but above all activists and artists, who has continued for more than a decade to fight for the recognition of the dignity of the Algerian people, to fight for the truth of what happened during the dark decade, to fight for political freedom and socio-economic justice. And people like Habiba Janin will continue to fight. And so the future of Algeria is a regime that will continue doing exactly the same thing, and people will continue fighting to end this cycle of alienation and illegitimacy.
I would. Sorry, I think I froze there. I feel the need to say something optimistic, and I think that whatever happens with the elections in June, as Thomas says, there's a kind of script that's being followed. There is a question of fatigue. There's a question of the increased brutality of the regime, but there's also a question of a new generation of activists that are new faces that we haven't been paying attention to before. One of the people, Mohamed Tajedid, who is known as the poet of the Hirak, who was taken to jail recently. These are figures, and then they were YouTube clips of his poetry circulating in Darija. These kind of intellectuals of the Hirak that are not the profile of the scholar or the university professor, that are a different generation, that are really of the Algerian milieu, that are not speaking to people in French. This gives, there's just a lot of hope in terms of what's happened over the last 3 years. And so I wouldn't want to take that away from the, people who've been taking to the streets and organizing for a long time with the kind of political stalemate of the moment, but it is there. So I'm not exactly sure how else to close. But for those of us watching this really closely, I think we just feel a lot of admiration and I'm a historian, so I'm not going to take up what happens next, because that's not my pay grade.
I'm not interested in that as much as what are the prospects, in the sense that what are some of the obstacles out there to things getting better, or what are some of the hopeful things that are happening. And I know you've shared enough in your discussion about this, so I just want us to get a glimpse towards the end. Okay, so I am again very happy and thankful to both of you for being awesome and insightful and inspiring. And we will always be calling upon you and others who study and research and write about and frequent North Africa in order to bring it into the fold in a much more organic way, so that we stop saying what I keep saying as a disclaimer, that we seem to know a lot more about other parts of the region. So thank you so much, folks. And I hope to keep connecting with you, even face to face when the time permits. And
and we should all be checking Mahraz's Twitter account to see if he's been following this discussion.
Yeah, I think Mahrez already tweeted that he was disappointed that Thomas is disappointed in him, especially that
we'll work it out. They'll work it out.
He can come to Paris Saint-Germain if you want. I will welcome him.
Well, you guys are going to lose Mbappe, it looks like, and Neymar is not happy. I don't know, Thomas. So we'll see. There's talk of Messi, but I don't believe it.
Let's focus on Algeria.
I know. Let's focus on Riyadh.
Chelsea, who might actually win the Champions League. What is this?
Let's focus on Riyadh Mahrez. Okay.
Ciao, everyone.
Thank you so much, folks. Bye bye. Au revoir. Au revoir.